Hello, everybody, and welcome to our latest E-rate webinar presented by Alec Johnson from EdTech Strategies. He is going to talk to us about PIA review. All right, Alec.
Thanks, Kate. As Kate mentioned, this is the latest in our series of workshops that we do on the E-rate program. This one is actually number 7. The series is supposed to run a total of 8 workshops, but we may tack on a ninth for reasons that we'll discuss during today's webinar. Before we start, everything in this presentation should be accurate at least as of 2 days ago. However, there are likely to be lots of changes. As always with the E-rate program, they do their best to keep us on our toes. So make sure that you keep an eye out for those changes. The best place to find those changes is typically in the news brief, which USAC issues on a monthly basis, and you can see the link to subscribe to that in the slide there. Um, they also have basic training videos available on their website, which can be useful for finding out basic information as you work through the program. If you have questions about any of the updates or anything else that you see, or you see something on the listserv that you have questions about, please don't hesitate to either reach out to me directly or reach out to the listserv. That's a theme you'll hear a couple times today. So, as always, questions are extremely welcome. The whole point of these sessions is to make them as useful as possible to you. I do ask that you save your questions until the end of the presentation if at all possible. The reason for that is that we'll do the Q&A after we finish the recording, and that way you can feel free to ask questions that are as in-depth or as simple as possible and not have to worry about it being memorialized in perpetuity on the internet. Please, if you have a question about a particular slide, try and note the slide number, and it just makes it easier to get back to it. And we'll take the Q&A session at the end of today's training, and it will go for as long as you need it. So basically, we're going to cover 3 things during the webinar today. The first, we're going to talk about what's new in the program. Normally, that's pretty minimal, but today it's pretty extensive. Second, we're going to just go over where we are in the E-rate process and what the program overall looks like. And then we'll get into the meat of today's presentation, which is talking about the PIA review process. So first, what's new? Most of you have probably heard that the FCC released an order approximately a week and a half ago, almost 2 weeks ago, covering a new bidding portal. Now, there are a lot of details that we don't yet have about the bidding portal, but there are a couple things that we do know. First, they're going to be putting a bidding portal in place. It is supposed to be in place for the FY 2028 E-rate funding year. So what does that mean for you? It means that while all of your applications that you do for this year, the year that is, I'm sorry, this upcoming year, 2026, and the following funding year, 2027, will not run through the bidding portal. Everything after that will. We will provide more information on exactly how that's going to work as that becomes available. I have spent quite a bit of time going through the bidding portal order. So if you have questions about that, happy to take them at the end of the session. The order does a number of things, however, in addition to the bidding portal. In addition to the bidding portal, it will eliminate, starting in fund year 2028, the Form 486. So instead of using the Form 46 to certify your service start date and your compliance with the Children's Internet Protection Act and start the invoicing process, all of that is going to be moved into the Form 471. That does have some implications, particularly for consortia, because it means that, for example, if you're a consortium, you'll need to collect the Forms 479 from your members before you can file your Form 471. Again, this comes into effect for 2028, so we do have a complete application cycle between now and then, and we'll talk about it more in upcoming trainings. There's some additional guidance that was released that comes effective for next year around what to do if you are seeking services that will change mid-year. Basically, they put greater flexibility in so that you won't lose funding in the way that you often would in the past when you shift from one service provider or one service level to another. They also included information for cost allocation. You will probably remember from previous trainings that we talked about how in the past, for internet access back in 2023, the FCC determined that as long as at least 90% of your internet access use was eligible, you didn't need to cost allocate out the ineligible portions, which was great. They've extended that uh, to cover all of Category 1. So that's going to be true of data transmission services as well as internet access. They also made some clarifications around shared equipment in non-instructional facilities and how you no longer need to cost allocate that equipment as part of your bid evaluation process. So that's great as well. They made some clarifications around what to do with spam bids and bids that come in after your initial 28 days are over. We'll cover that in next fall's training. But if you have questions, I'm happy to take them. Very importantly, they gave some flexibility for invoicing. So you'll recall that with invoicing right now, you have to have your invoicing completed by 120 days after the last date to receive services. You do have the ability to file a one-time extension, but you need to file that before that 120 days is up. They've changed that where now there will be a 15-day additional grace period for you to file that extension request. While I will still push you over the listserv to go ahead and get any invoices filed and any extensions filed, do know that you now have a little bit more flexibility. Another big change that's coming, and this one is important for this upcoming funding year, is that they are putting into place a requirement on the Form 498, which you may recall is a form that you've probably only filled out once, and it's where you included your banking information so that the USAT can make payments to you. If you are using BEARS, your Form 498 is going to need to be updated to include what's called a UEI, which is a Uniform Entity Identifier. That is an ID number that is assigned by the federal government to every library and school, and frankly, most other organizations around the country. That's where the SAM.gov registration that we talked about a couple of years ago comes in. That the main purpose of that is to make sure that you have a UEI. The key things to do here, we're going to need to update Forms 498 for entities that haven't done so already to include your UEI, and that UEI needs to be linked to the same taxpayer ID number as your FCC registration number. All of this sounds extremely complicated because it is. If you have questions about how to do this in the short term, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and let me know. And as I mentioned before, we're scheduled to do 8 sessions. I'm considering adding a ninth covering just this, which we would probably be doing in June because the requirement to have your UEI updated will come due sometime in August. If that is something that is of interest to you, please contact me or Kate, and we will go ahead and get a ninth training session set up. The last thing I wanted to flag as an update since our last training, IMLS, or rather ALA, was successful in its court challenge, keeping IMLS open, which is great news for libraries, in part because the data from IMLS in the Public Library Survey continues to be available. That information is critical for PIA review when it comes to things like the square footage of your libraries. So we'll talk about that when we get to PIA review. So that's what's new. So let's go ahead and talk just very quickly about the E-rate program, its structure, so that we are all at the same starting point today. So just as a reminder, the E-rate program requires that you file annual applications, and that doesn't mean that all of the forms need to be filed every year, but the majority of the forms do need to be filed every year. The exception to that are the procurement forms. Procurements, if you end up signing a multi-year contract or multi-year agreement, you don't need to rebid those on an annual basis. You can skip the procurement step and move straight back to the annual side of things, which is the Form 471 onwards. The application process for any given funding year typically starts anywhere from 6 to 9 months before the funding year itself, sometimes up to 12 months before the funding year itself. So you will be working on your applications for a funding year potentially for an entire year before any funding would be forthcoming. And you would be completing the invoicing process after that funding year is over, potentially for 4 to 6 months after the invoicing or after the funding year is over. So, what does that mean? It means that while your funding years, for the most part, don't overlap, your application processes do. And it's really important to know where in the process you are at any given time. For example, this somewhat crude diagram is designed to show us where we are vis-a-vis the three current funding years that folks have to worry about. So we are in fund year 2025 right now, receiving services. That's the red line up at the top. You should be receiving services under fund year 2025 for approximately another 6 weeks until that funding year comes to an end, at which point we will move into the receipt of services for fund year 2026. Fund year 2025, however, you won't be done with everything if you still need to do invoicing. You have several months after the funding year to complete the invoicing. We'll talk about that in the training next week. But that invoicing process for fund year 2025 can extend up through January, even February of 2027. For fund year 2026, you should have filed your Form 471 by now. With any luck, you've heard back from USAC and started the PIA review process that we'll be talking about today. The goal for all of those is, of course, to get your funding commitments as quickly as possible so that your service providers can provide you with service at a discounted rate, should you want to have your service provided on that basis. But we are now in the middle of the 2026 application review process. Keep in mind, again, you probably started the fund year 2026 process 6 months ago, maybe even longer ago than that. And the funding year doesn't start for another 6 weeks. So you've got plenty of 2026 related stuff to work on and worry about at this time. What we don't have to worry about yet is fund year 2027. But as you can see from where the blue bar starts at the bottom there, fund year 2027 is not far in our future. The process to start to apply for fund year 2027 opens in July of this year, and we will start our training series on that in the fall. I always include this image in my trainings. This is the official USAC application process chart. The important thing to keep in mind is that the applicant only does the stuff that's at the top. So right now you are in the middle of the application process, which is the green vertical section. And in fact, you should be in the program integrity assurance review, which is the box on the right-hand side of that green section. That means that you've already got the competitive bidding and the first part of the applying for discount section, which is the filing of the 471, completed. And with any luck, you'll get through PIA review fairly quickly and move into the receipt of services and then into invoicing. It's important to remember that for the E-rate program, the dates are somewhat flexible, but the deadlines are not. And what I mean by that is that the dates change on an annual basis. For a number of different components of the program, but the deadlines by which things need to be done are typically fairly inflexible. So your procurement and competitive bidding process, if you have to do that, if you're not in the middle of a multi-year contract, that's going to typically happen in the fall and early winter prior to the funding year. So that's when you would file your Form 470, release your RFPs, etc. The contract award and Form 471 are typically going to happen in the first couple months prior to the funding year. So you should have completed your Form 471 already, awarded your contracts to the winning vendors, and moved forward from that into the subject of today's training, PIA review. That typically happens starting in the spring and going into the summer. The more complex your application is, and that complexity means the complexity of the entities on your application. So if you're a consortium, you're more complex than a library system. If you're an individual library, you're less complex than a library system. Um, the more complex the entity is, or the more complex the services are, the longer PIA review typically takes. So for the networks in Massachusetts, most of the networks I would anticipate probably won't start receiving funding commitment decision letters until the summer at least. Sometimes it takes even longer than that. But hope springs eternal, and the goal of today's training is to make sure that you're ready to answer the questions that they may ask. The next two steps in the process, which we'll cover in next week's training, are the Form 486, which you file after you've gotten through PIA review and received your funding commitment decision letter, and then doing invoicing. And like I said, we will cover those in next week's training. We will also cover invoicing a second time in the fall, unless everybody's already got their invoices filed by the time we get around to doing the next set of trainings. So the PIA review process that we're going to talk about in more detail today, it takes place after you've filed your Form 471. And the goal of the PIA review process is basically to make sure that you have followed all of the program rules so that they can then award funding to you. It is not necessarily the most in-depth review process. There are times that they make mistakes, but generally, if you get through PIA review, that's one of the big hurdles that you need to go through before you can receive your funding. Sometimes PIA review happens right after an application is filed. Sometimes it takes months for them to get around to reviewing your application. Sometimes the reviews are very simple. Other times they are very complicated. Um, it really varies on an application to application basis and an applicant to applicant basis, and also, frankly, whether you're lucky or not. So there often is not necessarily a whole lot of rhyme or reason as to why one entity gets an in-depth review and another does not, but it does happen. When PIA review starts for your entity, you will receive an email indicating that they have questions for you. They'll also post the questions themselves in the EPC portal. And in fact, in the email that you get, there will be a link that will take you into the EPC portal and take you to the questions. We will go over how to get to the questions during today's training and talk about the kinds of questions that you're likely to receive. But it's incredibly important to make sure that you are monitoring either your email or EPC on a daily basis, if at all possible, simply to make sure that you don't miss any PIA questions. The reason for that is, of course, there's a strict deadline for those questions, and failure to answer them can lead to the denial of funding. So the last two steps, which we'll cover in the next training, we've got the Form 46, which you file after the start of services or the receipt of your funding commitment decision letter, whichever is later. If you file it more than 120 days after the start of service or the receipt of your funding commitment decision letter, you will start to lose funding. So you lose funding progressively. So if you file it 125 days after the start of service and you received your FCDL before the start of service, you'll lose 5 days worth of service. If you file it 300 days after the start of service, you'll lose 180 days worth of funding. So it's really important to make sure that you don't miss that Form 46 deadline. And we will go over that during next week's training. It also, the Form 46 also allows invoicing to start, and it includes your certifications for the Children's Internet Protection Act. The invoicing step, as talked about a moment ago, can take place during the funding year, but typically takes place after the funding year is over. You need to complete it in a timely fashion, or you will forfeit your funding. There are two different modes of invoicing. We'll talk about those two modes during the next training, but depending on which invoicing mode you select, the invoicing can happen on the applicant side or it can happen on the vendor side, and that is all taking place within EPC. Again, we'll get into both the Form 46 and invoicing in much more detail during next week's training. The last thing I want to talk about just very briefly in the E-rate process are audits. We haven't done an in-depth training on audits for a couple of years now, mostly because Massachusetts libraries have not been subject to a lot of audits in recent years. I'd be happy to do one if folks are interested. USAC has a whole series of different kinds of audits, and they will typically take place long after the funding year is over. It's part of why it is so important that you keep all of your documentation associated with the E-rate program for the minimum of 10 years after the last date to receive services, because they can come back and audit you at any point in that time frame. If you are undergoing an audit or you receive questions about an audit, please, please, please reach out to me, reach out to Kate, let us know, and let us help you with the process. All right, so with that review completed, let's get into the meat of today's discussion, PIA review. So as I said before, the PIA, which stands for Program Integrity Assurance Review, it's really designed to ensure your compliance with program rules. All of the applications will go through some degree of PIA review, and that PIA review from a logistical perspective, the interface for that is the E-Rate Productivity Center or EPC portal. When your reviewer is going over your application, if they have questions, you should receive a notification via email, which will go to the contact associated with your Form 471. You will also be able to review them within EPC, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. It is a good idea to check EPC on a regular basis, just in case. There are times when questions will come in via email and your email may mark it as spam or something like that. It's very important to make sure that those questions don't get missed because you have a relatively short deadline. Um, all of your questions and all of the responses will all take place in and through EPC. So when you submit your responses, you'll be doing that through the portal, just as you'll be able to review the questions that you receive through the portal. They will not email you the questions. They will only email you a notification that there are questions. The degree of review that each application goes through varies widely. Some applications get no questions at all. We are about to see the release of the third wave of funding associated with fund year 2026. Of the applications that I've been involved with that have been funded so far in 2026, roughly half of them received no questions at all during PIA review. Some of the others received quite a few questions, and some received just a couple. The questions that you receive can vary dramatically, both in terms of the number of questions and in the level of detail that they are seeking. So in some instances, they may ask you very basic information about the services that you're receiving and whether those services are eligible, and ask you to provide, for example, copies of contracts or quotes or invoices to get a better idea of what the services themselves are. In other instances, it may be something a little bit more complicated, like trying to prove that your particular library is eligible for LSTA, which is what makes you eligible for E-rate as well. The goal of PIA review, as I said before, is to ensure compliance with program rules. However, many of the questions that they will ask you are incredibly poorly written. And so, as much as it's important to answer the question that is being asked, it is much more important to understand the rules that are behind those questions and answer the question that they're supposed to be asking when it doesn't directly align with the question they're actually asking. One other quick note about PIA review is that if you discover that there are mistakes on your Form 471, you can often use the PIA review process to amend your Form 471 and correct those mistakes. Just reach out to your reviewer and let them know that you need to make an allowable correction to the form, and they can make those changes for you. In fact, they are able to make many more changes to the form than you're able to make with some of the post-commitment opportunities like the Form 500. So if you do notice something wrong on your Form 471, please speak up Let your PIA reviewer know. If you have questions about whether the thing that you've noticed is something that you should be bringing to PIA's attention, don't hesitate to reach out to me or to Kate, and we'll set something up to go over it with you. As I mentioned before, all PIA review questions are on a timer. The first round of questions is typically 15 days. When you receive a question, they will give you 15 days to respond to it. If you miss that 15-day window and don't request an extension, they will give you an automatic one-time 15-day extension. And at that point, they will also notify the library state E-rate coordinators, which in this case is Kate and myself, that you have questions out there. The good news is that Kate and I receive relatively few notifications that libraries have not responded to questions. That's great. Um, there are other timers that come through in the PIA review process as well, however, that you should be aware of. So, for example, they will often have follow-up questions, and those follow-up questions can have dramatically shorter timers. Sometimes it's as little as 1 day for you to respond. In other instances, they will respond with something that they call a notification, where they are making a change to your application, and no response is required. Those notifications are particularly terrifying because, for example, they can notify you that they're going to reduce your funding, but they don't tell you that you actually can respond to that notification and contest it before any kind of funding commitment decision letter comes out. This is why it's so important to make sure that you're checking EPC for any questions that they might have, because these things will all show up within the EPC portal. It's really important that you answer the questions before the timer runs out. The reason for that, put simply, is that the reason they are asking a question is because they have some concern about one of the many topics that PIA covers. And if you don't answer the question, they will typically assume the worst and assume that the answer to their question is something that will be deleterious to you. And we'll go through some of the kinds of questions they asked, or that they will ask during PIA review, and talk about how those responses can negatively impact you. But the key thing to remember is just be sure that you answer the questions before the timer runs out. If you aren't going to be able to answer the questions before the timer runs out, you can request an extension, and typically they will grant you a single 7-day extension to any questions that you have. So if you have questions that are out there and you're trying to gather the data, for example, but you won't have it by the time that they have set as your due date, go ahead and request an extension. They'll give you an additional 7 days, no questions asked. If you don't request the extension, they may move forward with processing your application, even without your data. So please make use of the ability to request the extension if you need it. One other thing I want to just point out, you'll recall during our last training when we were talking about the Form 471, how I told you time and time and time again that you cannot work with vendors on the Form 471 or on its predecessor, the Form 470. This is different. PIA review occurs after you have a written contract in place. And at that point, you can work with your vendor with whom you have that agreement, to go ahead and answer the questions that are being asked in PIA review. This is really critical because sometimes the questions require you to get information from the vendor or from your vendor, if they're a reseller, to get it from the manufacturer of the equipment that you're purchasing, things like that. So working with your vendor is something I would strongly encourage you to do when you're looking at PIA review questions. So that then begs the question, what are the kinds of topics that are typically covered in PIA review? There are 5 topics that typically get covered. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these here and then also a little bit later. First, the eligibility of entities. They are increasingly asking for verification that your library or library system is actually eligible to participate in the E-rate program. If you are being asked questions about the eligibility of your entity, please reach out to me or to Kate because MBLC is the entity that will most easily be able to provide you with documentation that your entity is indeed eligible for the E-rate program. The second common question topic has to do with the eligibility of services. This can work a couple different ways, where they ask you whether the service itself is eligible, whether it's only partially eligible, whether it needs to be reclassified within your application. All kinds of questions around the eligibility of services. You should have documentation related to the eligibility of your services. You can work with your service provider to put that documentation together. And if you have questions about that, like a broken record, I will say reach out to us. Let us know. We're happy to help. The third topic area where you will typically receive questions has to do with discount calculations. For libraries, as you know, your discount actually comes from the school districts that serve the location where your main library is located. So whatever that school district is, that's what's going to loan you your discount rate, and then the urban or rural designation comes from whether the majority of your library outlets are considered urban or rural. Fairly straightforward, except that if the school district that serves your main library doesn't participate in E-rate, USAC may reach out to you to try and get updated discount information for the school district. Now, obviously, you probably don't have any connection into the school district. You certainly probably don't have their discount information readily at hand. Not a problem. Reach out to me and to Kate. We will work with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to get you the information that you're going to need for that PIA review question. The fourth area where you will typically get questions has to do with competitive bidding. And you'll recall from our previous trainings, I've talked about how competitive bidding is sort of the keystone for all E-rate related questions. If you have screwed up in the competitive bidding process, you are typically unable to recover from that in a timely fashion. The questions that PIA will typically ask you have to do with your Form 470, your bid evaluation, and your bid award. So did you go through the appropriate steps and processes for each of those? We've covered those in prior trainings, so I'm not going to elaborate on them now. But as always, we're happy to help you work through those sorts of questions and issues. The last area that PIA questions typically cover has to do with the services that you're actually receiving. Those should be relatively straightforward, particularly for Category 1 services. It's typically telecommunication services or internet access services, and the speeds that those are being received at, and that will be in your contract or on your bill. But USAC may ask you to provide additional documentation about those services beyond what you've already provided. If they do, this should be relatively straightforward to provide, and you can always work with your vendor to get that information. So if those are the typical PIA question topics, how do we find these PIA questions? Well, as I mentioned before, you'll get an email with a notification. The easiest way to get to your PIA questions is literally to click on the link in the email. If you're already logged into EPC, that link will take you directly to the questions. If you're not logged into EPC, you'll have to log in to EPC, and it will just take you to the generic homepage for your library. If you then click on the link a second time, it'll take you directly to the questions. There's a less easy way, however, to get to them, which is useful if you were in a situation where, for example, the notifications may be filtered as spam, and so you want to be sure that you can check within EPC manually. The way you do this is to look at your pending inquiries. You'll log into EPC, and then on the landing page that you get to, at the very top, there's a whole area for pending inquiries. Go ahead and select the Form 471 under the first header of type, and you can see I didn't update this slide. You should select 2026 for the funding year under pending inquiries. My screenshot that I've got on the next slide is from 2024 because I don't have any screenshots yet for this year. But that will allow you to select the funding year as well. And then you click the Apply Filters button. Once you do that, a section will pop up underneath that showing you if there are any requests under the pending inquiries section. And you can click on each one individually to go ahead and open it. So this is a screenshot. Again, it's from 2024, but it shows what this looks like on a very simple basis. You log into your landing page. You log into EPC, you end up on your landing page. At the top, there's this pending inquiries option right here. If you go ahead and click on the little arrow next to pending inquiries, you can select a type and you would select Form 471, and then funding year, you would select 2026. And then you would come over onto the right, click Apply Filters, and it will show you any questions that USAC currently has outstanding for you underneath that. And you can click under inquiry name on the individual inquiry, and it will show you what that particular question is. Now, notably, you need to do this for each inquiry that they have. So you'll see here on this example, we have two discount related inquiries. You can tell they're discount related because the inquiry name is requested discount. You will need to click on both of those in this instance to go ahead and answer both sets of questions. There is an even more complicated way to do this, which involves basically opening up the Form 471 and then clicking on the application and checking to see if there are any review questions associated with it. So to do that, again, you log into EPC. You click on the name of your library system, which will show up on the top left. You then click on FCC Forms and select the Form 471 and the appropriate funding year from the dropdowns, and then you click on the application in question. So to do that visually, first we click on the name of the library system in EPC. Then we click on FCC Forms up at the top right. Then we select the Form 471 for the category, and we select the appropriate funding year. And that will then open up all of the forms, the Forms 471 that you filed for that funding year. You can then open each of those Forms 471 individually. When you open up the Form 471, you'll see it tells you the review status and everything else about the form on this summary page. But what we're interested in is the PIA review questions. And to find those PIA review questions, we click on Review Inquiries up at the top. And once we click on Review Inquiries, it will list all of the pending inquiries at the top and then submitted inquiries down at the bottom. The submitted inquiries are the questions we've already answered. The pending inquiries are the questions that still need to be answered. So once you've found your questions, how do you respond to them? They actually don't make it easy. It's a little bit frustrating. If you have inquiries listed, what you need to do, you can't click on them directly, but you can click on Respond to Inquiries at the top of the page, and then click on the individual inquiries on the page that comes up to get the questions listed. You'll then put in your responses to the questions, and you can either save them if you're going to come back to them later, or you can submit the responses. You can also request extensions from the page where you first see all of the inquiries. I mentioned before how important it is to make sure you request those extensions if you need them, and I'll show you where you do that in just a moment. One critical thing to remember about PIA review, only one person can be engaged with a set of PIA questions at a time. That means only one person at a time can be looking at the questions or working on draft responses. And it's really important when you're done looking at the questions that you click the close or save and close on each page. The reason for that is that if you don't close it, it keeps those questions effectively checked out to you, sort of like it was a book that you're checking out from the library. Nobody else in your organization can even see what the questions are as long as you have them checked out. So it's really critical to make sure that you click the close or save and close on each page. So again, this is the page where it shows all of our inquiries. If we want to answer any of the inquiries, we need to go ahead and click on Respond to Inquiries up at the top. You'll notice just to the left of that is the request extension, where we would request extensions to the inquiries. Once we click Respond to Inquiries, it brings us what almost looks like the same page, but you'll notice that whereas before when it listed the questions here under pending inquiries, there were no hyperlinks or anything that you could click on. Once you click on respond to inquiries, each of the inquiries themselves becomes a hyperlink. So you'll see that under the name, where it says the name for each is requested discount. We can then click on those hyperlinks to actually see what the questions are. And so in this case, when we click on that, it asks a whole series of questions about, in this case, it was a series of school questions about whether a school was truly independent and please provide documentation that it's independent. You may be asked similar questions about your library, whether your library is eligible for LSTA, and please provide documentation to support that. There are a number of issues that you run into with these templates that they have for questions. The key thing I want to flag for you is that you need to respond to each of the free response questions on a template, even if the template themselves say that you don't need to. What do I mean by that? Well, in this particular example, if you respond to question one here at the top, and then you upload your documentation in 1A, it then says down here in 1B, or I'm sorry, it says at the bottom of 1A, you have no further questions. 1B then asks two follow-up questions, which you would think you could skip. But if you try to submit your response without putting anything in those boxes, you'll get an error. So just make sure you put NA or not applicable into each of the free response fields because there isn't enough intelligence built into the form where even if there are, it says it's conditional and you've responded to everything you need to respond to, chances are pretty good that it will throw you an error if you haven't put something in all of the free response fields. So we talked a little bit about the common kinds of questions, but I want to go into a little more detail real quickly before we finish up. For category one, which is going to be your internet and telecommunication services, the most common questions that you'll receive will be explanations of the services that that are being provided to you. So are they WAN services? Are they internet access services? Are they telecommunication services? Second, they'll ask for an explanation of the costs, and this happens whenever the costs that you have in your Form 471 don't immediately line up with what's in your contract or quote that you provided to USAC, or if they just haven't bothered to review your contract or quote. Sometimes if you have combined multiple costs into a single line item, so if you, for example, added in the taxes, USAC will get confused about that, ask you to figure out how you got to the totals that you have, and then we'll try to break your taxes or other services out into additional line items. They will also attempt to remove any ineligible services or items, as well as any items that may have been delivered prior to the start of the funding year. So if you have included ineligible items or costs in your application, they'll try and remove that from your Category 1 application. Um, they also, as we mentioned before, will modify the eligibility percentages associated with your services or remove anything that they believe to be ineligible that you may not have realized was. Uh, you can work with your vendor to support your arguments for what's eligible and what's not. So please be sure that you talk with your vendor if you are running into issues around the eligibility of services. You can also reach out to me or Kate, and we'll be happy to help you. The last common kind of change has to do with discount calculations, and that again typically happens when they don't have the school lunch data from the school district, and they will ask you to provide that. Technically, it's not your responsibility to do it, but USAC will ask you for it, and if they do, let Kate or myself know, and we will work with you to get that data validated by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. On the category two side, the common questions are similar, but a little bit different. So the first one, they will ask you about your budget calculation, or they'll ask you to confirm your square footage. This has to do with how those C2 budgets are calculated. You'll remember that that is a function of the square footage of the library. And they will ask you where the data that you have in EPC comes from and can you validate it. The easiest way to validate it is with the public library survey data, which will typically be 2 or 3 years old. So if your square footage has changed in the last 2 years, the PLS survey won't work. But if your library hasn't changed in size in a couple of years, you can use the PLS data to validate this. And we went over how to do that back in the fall. But if you have questions, just let me know. They'll also ask frequently for an explanation of the costs included in your application, things like the make and model and quantity of items that you're purchasing, even if all of this is included in your contract in exquisite detail. Part of that is that they often don't bother to look at the contract ahead of time. Other times, it's that they misinterpret information in the contract. So please be sure that you can explain the costs that you have. And oftentimes you can just refer them to the contract document when you do that. We already talked about under category one how they can modify eligibility percentages and remove ineligible costs. This is particularly common with category two with services like firewalls, which have eligibility percentages that seem to change on an almost annual basis. So be aware that those eligibility percentages can change, and that will change your costs associated with it. In the past, you'll recall that they would frequently change service types between internal connections and basic maintenance of internal connections, particularly for licenses. This should be less problematic going forward because the FCC has clarified to USAC that almost all of those licenses should actually be considered internal connections, which is great news for libraries. It simplifies things dramatically, but you still need to be careful about it. USAC will also often make modifications of the classification associated with an item. So they will take, for example, an SFP, which is a device that gets inserted into your switch and converts things from fiber optic to copper. They will change that based on their most recent interpretation of it. So you may have applied for it as a switch. They may consider it a transceiver or a module, and they'll bounce it between those subcategories within the eligible services list. Usually this is okay, but if you have questions about it, don't hesitate to reach out. We already talked about under category one how they'll modify your discount calculation or ask questions about it, and how Kate and I can help you with that. So the most common problems that people run into in PIA review are quite simply the failure to actually respond in time. That's the number one issue. So please be sure that you do respond to the inquiries that you receive. The second most common failure is for you to respond, but you respond in a way that the PIA reviewer can't understand. So it's really important to make sure that you keep things as simple as possible and in as plain English as possible. Don't provide the extremely complex technical descriptions unless that's what they ask for. The other big issue that we've seen in the past is PIA will modify your applications. And they will do so where they will change a category of service or they'll change the category, the quantities or amounts of items that you're purchasing. And often they will change that just with a notification. So they won't send you an email saying that there's a question. Instead, they will just update it and you'll have a notification that's waiting for you in EPC, but you may not receive an email for it. When those changes happen, you often will only have like 24 hours to respond to it. So please, that's why it's so important to make sure that you stay on top of your PIA review questions. The big gotchas for PIA review, as I mentioned before, the biggest is those conditional questions and you not providing responses to them. You need to put something in the field because otherwise, when you click submit, it won't actually submit. That brings up the second big gotcha. You need to be sure you click submit. If you click save, it doesn't actually submit the response. If you click submit and it doesn't look like it's going through, go ahead and scroll back up the page and figure out where the error is. Typically, it'll be a box that will be outlined in red. When that happens, that's a missing response, and they want you to put something in there, even if all you need to put in there is N/A. I showed you how to request an extension earlier. Please do request the extension if you have any questions. And then, as I've said a billion times during this presentation, please reach out to me or Kate if you have questions. The questions, as I said before, are often extremely poorly worded. And so it's really important that you understand what they're actually asking for rather than what they are literally asking for. So if we can help you come to that understanding, don't hesitate to let us know. As of last week, two funding waves had been released. The third funding wave, in theory, should be released today. Uh, in those 2026 applications that were filed, there were 24 funding requests across 18 different Forms 471. Of the 24 requests, four of them were funded in the first or second wave. Five were actively being reviewed, which meant that they had asked questions and applicants had responded, or they were in final review status. And then 15 have either not started review or there's been some review and then it got reassigned to somebody else. So it moved back into assigned to IR, which stands for initial review status. Now, it's important to note that the status of these things can and does change. Of course, I'm giving lie to that in that you'll see that the date at the top there is 5/7. None of these have changed since 5/7. So it's worth keeping in mind that while they can change and they will change, it doesn't always happen as quickly as we'd like to see. So once PIA review is completed, the next step is the issuance of the funding commitment decision letter. That funding commitment decision letter will be emailed to you and will show up within EPC. So you'll get an email with a copy of it, but you can also go into EPC and click on News, and it'll be there as one of your notifications. The funding commitment decision letter has two components. There's a PDF file, and then there's an Excel spreadsheet. Make sure that you review both of these. If there are any changes that USAC has made, they will be outlined in the funding commitment decision letter. And if you disagree with those changes, you need to appeal within 60 days. If there are no changes, or if the changes are things that you agree with, you can go ahead and move on to the next form, the Form 46, which again, we'll cover next week. So as always, a couple of final thoughts. First, make sure that you stay abreast of what's going on the listserv. We try to post important information there. The next thing I expect that we'll be posting, aside from notifications about the trainings, is a summary of the order that was released a week and a half ago. I hope to have that out in the next couple of days. Second, make sure that you sketch out your timelines and make any necessary changes related to your invoicing. So this is particularly important. You'll need to make sure that the invoicing mode and the invoicing deadlines are things that you keep in mind for both your 2025 and 2026 applications. As always, don't be afraid to ask questions. We'll do that here in just a moment, but you can always ask questions on the listserv or directly to me or to Kate. You can also reach out to the E-Rate Client Service Bureau, which you can do either via the 888 number or within EPC, and ask your questions of the Client Service Bureau. Lastly, as always, make sure you stay in control of and monitor your applications. And please take advantage of E-Rate if it can help you. It's a tremendous opportunity for funding for Massachusetts libraries. So with that, we're going to go ahead and end the recording portion of this webinar and move straight into questions.